All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the NACBS. And I want to welcome you all today to join us in hearing more from Laura Tavolacci about her latest book. And Anna Winterbottom will be joining her in conversation. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who's going to speak for a little bit. Anna will comment after that, and then there will be time for questions following that. So do keep your questions in mind. You can also feel free to drop them in the chat at any point throughout, and then we can turn to those. Or once we open the questions, you can raise your Zoom hand. Either way is fine. So today we are joined by Laura Tavolacci, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chile and received her PhD from the University of California, Davis. She teaches global history, comparative empires, and the history of science. Her first book, which is what we're going to be hearing about today, is Baptist Bengalis and the Construction of Agricultural and Horticultural Science in India, 1793 to 1840, which was published with Palgrave Macmillan's Cambridge Imperial and Postcolonial Studies series. Her work has also been published in History Workshop Journal, the Journal of Historical Geography, Irish Studies Review, and Endeavour. Her current project, Plants and Their Social Lives Across the British Empire, 1850 to 1950, looks at colonial Calcutta as a center for plant breeding and the exchange of seeds, plants, and knowledge about them across the empire. So thanks for joining us today, Laura. And she's going to be joined in conversation by Anna Winterbottom, who is a historian of medicine, science, and environment with a focus on the early modern India Ocean region at McGill. She is the author of Hybrid Knowledge in the Early East India Company World in 2016, and she's the co-editor of 3 books, most recently Women, Environment, and Networks of Empire in 2023. So thanks for joining us, Anna. And Laura, I will turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody. This is actually a better turnout than I was thinking there would be in the middle of a Thursday, in the middle of the semester when everybody's busy. So thank you very much. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen here because I have a little PPT to help organize the talk. Although admittedly, oh, wait, why is this? This all appears okay, or is there a small window blocking it for others?
Nope,
Because
look,
in mine, there's a small window blocking it. I just want to make sure that's not how it appears for other people. It's a little different.
nope,
Okay.
clear for us.
Wonderful. Okay. Admittedly, this research project doesn't have a ton of images, so apologize for that. This was sort of a time before they put a ton of images with things, but hopefully I'm going to give it more of a narrative story. So I'm going to begin with kind of where I began with the research of this project, which was a conflict within the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India that still exists today. It's called the Agri-Horticultural Society of India today, and it still exists. And it was created by a British Baptist missionary in 1820. And when I first started the project, I was focused on that scientific society, basically to understand the role of agricultural and horticultural science in changes in imperial governance that are well discussed in the historiography of British India in the 19th century. And then part of this project, of course, was to visit the archive of the Agri-Horticultural Society of India in their current garden in Alipur, that's a neighborhood in Kolkata today. And when I visited there, I was surprised to find out that it's actually not the original Alipur garden that was started earlier in the 19th century in the history of the scientific society. Um, that Alipur garden was actually shut down in 1835. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And after that, they had their garden and nursery in the company's botanical garden at Shibpur, which of course has a much more colonial and imperial connotation than the original Alipur garden. So I thought, this is interesting. Why did they shut it down? And when I investigated it in the sources, I found out that it was part of a longer term power struggle and conflict within the society between 1829 and 1835, out of which what emerged was a society that was much more focused on agriculture than horticultural. They decided to shut down the Alipur garden specifically because there was this discussion where they're starting to say, hey, these horticultural projects don't make as much money. They cost too much and they don't make as much money. They don't have as much support. So let's go more for these agricultural projects. Now, I'm going to start with a description, a little bit more of a description of what happened with this 1829 to 1835 conflict. But really, what the story is about is I began with this conflict, and then I wanted to understand it better. I wanted to give it a little bit of a genealogy, which led me into researching and understanding the motivations of the missionaries who founded the society. So I'm going to start out with a description of the conflict and then give a few more details of this genealogy that I perform in the book to understand the motivations and the ideas that later inspired this conflict. Now, the conflict started in 1829, and I really think that that is the most important event to understand the shutting down of the Alipur Garden in 1835. What happened is that the society was having economic crises. This is a sort of pre-crises to the famous 1830-1833 agency house crisis that's discussed in the historiography quite a bit. They started to have problems a little bit earlier in 1829. They created this very dismal financial report of the society. And as a result, there was a discussion in the meeting. What are we going to do about this? And the first thing they decided to do is, well, we need to start having elections for the officers of the society, which had previously just been appointed at a meeting and just sort of held their position in perpetuity. And the language within the meeting is maybe if we have elections every year, this is going to force the leadership of the society to be more dynamic and promote better management so we won't be having these financial problems. And they immediately held elections. However, what was interesting, all the same officers got voted again. So really, there wasn't that much motivation to change it, except for one, the president. And the first president of the society from 1820 to 1829 was William Leicester, who was a justice in the Sadr Diwani department, the Sadr Diwani court. And who they replaced him with was Edward Ryan, who was soon to be the Chief Justice of the Bengal Supreme Court. So a very kind of typical genealogy of the advent of liberal rule in British India beginning in 1829. And in a later eulogy, some of the members sort of made sense of this sort of coup d'etat in the presidential leadership, is that they thought Edward Ryan had more connections with British power and the company state, and especially the court of directors, and that they could use this to better their financial situation. And to understand a little bit more about this difference, we have to understand what was the administration of the initial president, William Leicester, like to understand his distinction with Edward Ryan. Under William Leicester, he was the first president from the very beginning, the very initial start of the society in 1820. He was an avid gardener. He loved gardening. And he was especially interested in fruit trees. And as a result, the largest initial projects of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India, even before they got and opened the Alipur Garden, was the importation of British and other fruit trees from the rest of India and other parts of Asia, and then the distribution of these fruit trees to members, and sometimes experiments in grafting and these kinds of things. He also, most notably in other travels around other parts of India, uh, noted Indian gardening strategies, particularly grafting of fruit trees, of which I have here an image of an article that he published in the society's transactions on these new modes of grafting, specifically that he learned from bagbans or master gardeners working for princes around the Jaipur area. He even contracted one of their relatives to come work for him in Kolkata and teach his Bengali gardeners these new methods of grafting. And I put there an illustration, which doesn't appear in this volume 1 article. I got it from later. One of the methods of grafting he discusses in this article is what he calls the Chinese mode of grafting, which was used by these master gardeners in North India. And it kind of enters into the discourse of the society and gets spread around as a new method of fruit tree grafting in the greater Calcutta area until eventually, towards the middle of the 19th century, it's treated just as part of Bengali gardening, and they call it guti, or in English, they call it gootering, kind of their own version of the verb. So you can see his vision, William Leicester's vision of horticulture was mixed. It was very much based, um, his vision of the society was very much mixed, more between horticulture and agriculture, much more centered on gardens, but also an agricultural view about increasing the available of food. So they talk a lot about useful plants, what's useful. They want to advocate for new plants for medicine and for food, principally. Now, Edward Ryan is sort of the opposite. He came to the society without any previous experience in gardening or in agriculture. He really knew nothing about it. Um, and as I mentioned before, he's sort of emblematic of where the majority of British members of the society wanted to bring the activities. They wanted to get more pecuniary aid from various organs of the British state, both in London with the Court of Directors and in India and Kolkata. And so it was really a stretch and a new vision in which horticulture became less important, less segregated, not as remunerative, and instead, to gain more attention from the British state, they were going to focus on agriculture, and agriculture meant not so much producing for local market, not so much producing food, and more producing for export. So you really see this sort of division, and I put this picture here to show this new sort of colonial iteration of the society after these 1829 to 1835 changes. They had a much more expanded membership that helped to pay for the construction of Metcalfe Hall, that became a really important mainstay of the city center in Kolkata that we have here. And it was a much more, seemingly more stark division between agriculture and horticulture. Now, what happened in reaction to this coup d'etat? Important for the genealogy that I'm going to explain now is that William Carey, who was vice president at the time, an English Baptist missionary centered in the originally Danish settlement of Srirampur across the Hooghly River from Kolkata, he was the founder of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India in 1820. When the new election took out his friend William Leicester, he resigned his membership in protest. And he said he didn't want to serve as vice president for any other president besides William Leicester. And the understanding had previously been that whoever obtained the position of president should be president for life. Now, a couple of months later, he quietly rejoined and was renamed vice president. So the divorce didn't last for very long, but you can see he made a sort of clear alliance with sort of a more mixed or horticultural view of what the society ought to be doing. So going back a little further, because my idea is I want to understand uh, what caused this conflict. Because the conflict makes it seem like there's a huge divide between agriculture and horticulture. However, in the previous iteration of the society, before 1829 or 1835, if you want to, depending on which date you want to use, in the more horticulturally based vision, they really advocated export agriculture too. It's not that export agriculture was 100% new. It's more that the early iteration of the society had this sort of mixed version, right? It wasn't always clear the difference between a garden, the difference between production for local market and production for export. There was not so much the vision. They had more of a mixed vision. And I highlight here in this slide the immediate genealogy of the society that helps explain this earlier mixed view of horticulture and agriculture is that the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India wasn't 100% new. It sort of had a precursor that didn't last very long. It was specifically a horticultural society started by Nathaniel Wallach, who was a great friend of William Carey since they both lived in Srirampur. And well, frankly, William Carey helped Nathaniel Wallach achieve multiple of his positions that he held in the British Indian state. And when Nathaniel Wallach was serving temporarily as the superintendent of the company's botanical garden at Shivpur, he started this specifically horticultural science society. And William Carey was a member. This is sort of treated as the precursor of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India. And it didn't last long because it couldn't gain enough members that paid dues really to last very long to make it worth it. But it was in this context where they came up with this idea. We really need to make a scientific society, sort of in the same vein. They had this idea that it would be in a similar vein to those sorts of agricultural and horticultural science organizations in England. This early horticultural and agricultural mixed view contained some very interesting internal contradictions that might be very similar with most sorts of colonial discourses. And William Carey, as well as the other Srirampur missionaries, were very important in helping to construct this vision. And I have this quote here to help kind of show or illustrate, highlight one of these contradictions. It is written in an early letter, very early on. He was sent to India in 1793. So this is a letter he sent back to the leadership of his missionary society, the Baptist Missionary Society, in 1796, sort of observing, sharing his observations about the environment where he and his family lived in Bengal. And he says here, quote, edible vegetables scarce and fruit far from plenty. You will perhaps wonder what we eat, many which no one eats in England. As arum, 3 or 4 sorts, poppy leaves. We also cut up mallow by the bushes for our food, amaranths of 3 sorts we also eat, and several other kinds, capsicum, pompions, gourds, calabashes, the melangena or eggplant fruit. And so we see this sort of internal contradiction. He starts out saying vegetables are scarce. And then he goes into a rather long, varied list of vegetables. I would say, tentatively, I would say even comparatively to England at the time, this is a lot more vegetables than the average sort of laborer or peasant would have had access to. Um, so already they were sort of coming up with this internally contradictory view that depicts why they were so interested in horticulture, right? That they believed edible vegetables were scarce. There's also some beginning of racialization, where they thought some of the vegetables that Bengalis ate weren't very good for the English Constitution, and they needed to improve this available of vegetables by sort of a mix Orientalist, Anglicist sort of view. So they wanted to improve local varieties and at the same time import English varieties so that there would be more variety of vegetables, according to them. And so, how did they come up with this view? So, the genealogy takes me back a little bit further, and I'll go through these genealogies much faster to be as close to the 20-minute time mark as possible. But this took me back to understand a little bit more about this mixed horticultural agricultural view. Um, in the theology and the lives of the Sri Lumpur missionaries. And this is also another part of the project because the Sri Lumpur missionaries, for those of you who don't know, have a fairly prominent position in the historiography of early British rule. Because they were located in the Danish settlement of Sri Lumpur, right across from Kolkata, and they were highly important in the early um, 19th century in the life of Calcutta. And typically these sorts of biographies or books that talk about the Sri Lumpur missionaries always mention their interests in the plant sciences, especially William Carey, who was quite involved with botanical collection and botanical compendiums, the company Botanical Garden, as well as founding the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India. However, these biographies and histories that analyze the significance of the Sri Lumpur missionaries don't center the plant projects. They're always kind of mentioned as like an addition, kind of at the side. And usually the focus is much more on their dominant activities, which were translation, printing, and education. So I had an interest in sort of centering why and how they came to be interests in plants, especially horticulture and agriculture, to explain the early iteration of the life of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India and explain a little bit more the conflict and division that later developed. And I think a key and center in understanding the missionary interests in plants is the illustration of this quote, which is another largely discussed in historiography theme that many people notice that a lot of Christian, especially Protestant, literature really loves the use of agricultural, gardening, plant metaphors to describe spiritual processes. And this is another one of those, written by one of the missionary wives at one of the stations that was governed by the Sri Lumpur missionaries. She says, "Oh, when will the wilderness world become a fruitful field? Come, Lord Jesus, come quickly." But I would argue that this is more than a metaphor, it's a metonymy. And this happened, and the first chapters of my book kind of talk about the theological genealogy of the Sri Lumpur missionaries to explain why they became so interested in plants and plant sciences. And it basically has to do with the evangelical tension between divine, um, divine instigation of salvation and human action. There was always this sort of tension, and they had their own particular view on these debates that was sort of a mediation, not complete rejection of predestination, but a modification of it. And now, when the English missionaries first arrived in India, this view started to get challenged by Bengali converts, and especially their lack of converts they really had. But they were very suspicious of all the Bengali Hindu converts. And they had a whole system of surveillance and punishment to make sure that Bengalis were living in a way that would prove their sanctification, prove their salvation according to their evangelical precepts. And they always found them lacking. You know, for example, some of the reasons the Bengali converts would be punished within the congregation, being involved with any sort of ritual or act associated with Hinduism in any way, including the practice of medicine associated with Hinduism, levity of conduct during communion. The sources are filled with these sorts of conflicts. And you see, as a result, with time, within like just a couple of decades, the missionaries are beginning to racialize Hindu bodies and say the usual process of salvation and conversion doesn't hold for Hindus because their bodies are so inured in an unproductive and immoral social system that we need to see improvement in their life first. We need to see human action first. The eschewing of vice, the living of a moral life, these kinds of things. We need to see that first before we'll even be convinced that they're converts. And in the center of these discussions, a lot of times plants and agriculture and horticulture come in. So most of the mission stations had their own gardens and farms. They were highly involved with indigo plantations. I discussed many of the applications of plants. And the idea within this is that when they see the wilderness, the environment ordered, like in a garden or in an agricultural field, this time they're assured of a spiritual improvement. I call it sort of a moral frontier that's both inner and outer. The outer part was a lot more comfortable than their various conflicts that they had with Bengali converts. And likewise, these interests in agriculture and horticulture within the missionary network centered on the idea of labor as a form of moral improvement. And also this sort of dichotomy, because they had this view that I find very typical in a lot of British authors at that time, that agricultural vocation was more moral kind of labor than laborers, right? It promoted rural living. It promoted a moral family, a paternalist order. And so if we could get these Bengalis practicing a moral and improved, more productive agriculture or gardening, they would learn from these labor arrangements and make a more morally stable society. So here I have sort of the arc, very briefly, in which I discuss this theological and moral genealogy of the Baptist interests in plant projects and plant sciences um, that help to lead up to and explain William Carey's foundation of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India. Now, this book is, of course, touching on a variety of different literatures, but one being on the left, Nature and the Godly Empire, that is not about India. It's more about the Pacific Islands region, but it talks about the mixing of theology and religion with the sciences that I think is particularly potent and important, right? If we talk about hybrid sciences, we're not just talking about mixtures between British imperial and local ideas. We can also talk about the mix between religion and science. You know, we can help to problematize this divide because there was no divide for the majority of the people in my study. And likewise, the other two books are kind of somewhat newer books that highlight the ways that missionaries had influence on British Indian rule. Mostly they tend to focus on the government. And I like to think of the ways that evangelicals and missionaries had influence in other ways, more cultural, more about knowledge, more about science, as we can see in this project. And finally, I would like to end with one more quote that helps to highlight the view on agriculture within this more mixed horticultural agricultural view that was published in the missionary publication Friend of India that continued and is kind of a historical source that lots of people use for the 19th century in colonial India. And they had this specific article on the agriculture of India. And they say, while it is recognized that agriculture promotes the integrity of customs and peace more than most other occupations, the current situation of the farming classes in India encourages all that is unjust and oppressive on the part of the landowner, as well as all that is petty, evasive, and rebellious in those who till the soil. An independent farmer, free of debt and joyfully anticipating that his entire small harvest will be his own, is almost a rarity in society. And so you can see that their vision is mixed, right? It includes agriculture. It's not, I'm not talking about a division, such a stark division between horticulture and agriculture. Indeed, oops, there we go. I would rather, I'll end with some, am I still sharing the screen here?
No,
Nope,
you're
I think
good.
I accidentally left the screen sharing. Sorry. I pressed the button and it left. So I'm going to leave just a couple of small remarks after that quote. Um, that while there are sort of these economic difficulties and particular political contingencies that explain the 1829 to 1835 crisis in leadership and show kind of how agriculture came to be more segregated from horticultural science in India and much more focused on export agriculture. It doesn't necessarily represent a clean break. And so by showing the genealogy, I can show not just the differences between the new liberal view, the new liberal segregated view of agriculture, but also continuities with the past. Um, and how some of those missionary ideas, especially its moral and material contradictions, help to impact the new liberal approach. There we go. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Laura. Amanda, do you want to? Okay, I'll just jump in then. Thank you so much. Well, firstly, Amanda, for hosting us, Laura, for that wonderful talk, and also for encouraging me to read your book and for giving me this opportunity to respond. So I'm just going to, and I heartily recommend to anybody who hasn't already read the book to get hold of a copy and do so. Um, I'm just going to mention a few of what I thought were the major contributions of the book and offer a few comparative thoughts, perhaps contextualize the book a little bit in relation to some other recent publications. And then I'll end with a few questions for Laura and then open it up to everyone else. So the first thing I appreciated about the book is that it provides a really excellent case study of the relationship between missionary groups in India and the East India Company. And as you mentioned, this relationship was earlier assumed to be mostly adversarial, but your work and other works like Penelope Carson's study have reframed it as rather more collaborative. The book shows that the Baptist missionaries based in Srirampur had strong connections with the East India Company settlement in Calcutta, especially through botanical collaborations. So things like William Carey's involvement with William Roxburgh's Hortus Bengalensis. And the missionaries were also entangled with the settlement through their involvement in education, including the production of textbooks, which you talk about later in the book, and that the kind of ongoing effect of those textbooks on the Bengali curriculum. So many of the aspects of the relationship you describe between the Srirampur missionaries and the Calcutta settlement reminded me of the relationship between the Moravian mission at Tranquebar and the Madras settlement of the East India Company. In both cases, the missionaries were based outside the English settlement. Actually, in both cases, They're working within Danish settlements. But they were deeply embedded in networks of collecting, botanizing, and gardening, as well as being involved in projects of translation to and from Indian languages. There's also some overlap in terms of personnel because William Roxburgh worked first in Madras and he collaborated closely with the Tranquebar missionaries, people like Christoph Samuel John. And then later when he moved to Calcutta, as you mentioned, he worked closely with William Carey and others. I wanted to mention a recent chapter by Pratik Chakrabarti on the Tranquebar missionaries. It's in this book. I don't know if you can see it well, but it's Histories of Health and Materiality in the Indian Ocean World. So Chakrabarti's chapter is called Europe Doesn't Want You. And like your book, it really highlights the religious aspects of the study of nature. And I think this brings us to another valuable contribution of your book. It highlights the spiritual dimensions of agriculture, horticulture, and also this wider colonial idea of improvement, which we tend to think of as quite secular. But I really liked your focus on moral improvement. So the Sri Rampur missionaries really saw working in the garden as a means not only of improving the landscape, but of improving their converts. And you just mentioned how suspicious they were of their own converts. And that was a surprising thing for me, which I wasn't aware of before I read the book, but it makes sense. And especially the context you gave us in your talk of how that was connected to kind of increasingly racialized discourse more broadly. The book also adds nuance to the claim that the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India was a site for collaboration between Europeans and Indians. And I really appreciated your close reading of works by the Bengali members of the society, like Radhakanta Deb, who really had a different interpretation of the concept of improvement, one that was much less rooted in morality and much more focused on practical solutions to mitigating environmental challenges. So as you mentioned in the talk, the book argues that there was a growing distance that emerged between the European and elite Bengali members of the society after the transition from the focus on horticulture or a mixture of horticulture and agriculture towards this focus on growing cash crops for export. And finally, the book emphasizes the real dependence on missionaries and other settlers on expert Indian gardeners, the Maulis, who were responsible for the real work of horticulture and whose knowledge of the local environment shaped the company gardens, the missionary gardens, and the society's garden at Alipur. And I like the detail you gave us there in the talk about the vegetables as well, because of course these gardeners are also shaping the diets of both the Indian and the European populations of the growing city of Kolkata. So I really enjoyed this, this detailed discussion of the transition away from gardening to agriculture, because one thing that's always struck me when looking at the earlier settlements of the East India Company and maps of those settlements is just how many gardens there are, right? And the primary function of those gardens is to feed the settlements, but they also have these functions in growing medicinal plants, experimenting with local and imported plants as well. And so I know there's been a lot of focus on the Calcutta Botanical Garden and its embeddedness in imperial networks, but I'd like your focus on how it also overlapped with other local gardens, so the Missionary Garden and the Alipur Garden. As for the shift away from gardening, I think this goes hand in hand with a wider shift in the intellectual culture of the East India Company, away from prioritizing local experience in India and towards a privileging of metropolitan science. And I wanted to note this recent book by Jessica Ratcliffe, Monopolizing Knowledge, which also does a good job of describing that shift. Finally, on the topic of gardeners, those people who did the hands-on work of making plants grow. I'm so interested in this topic, and it reminded me of another recent book. So this is Creolizing Science by Dorrit Brixius. And this focuses on the reliance of European colonists in Mauritius on gardeners. The difference here, of course, is that there's no indigenous population in Mauritius, so the gardeners were also coming from elsewhere. But something that interested me was that some of the most prominent gardeners she discusses actually came from Bengal. So she has an interesting example of someone called Charles Rama, who was originally enslaved, but he became the head gardener of the Mauritius Botanical Garden. And he was originally from Bengal. So I have a couple of questions specifically about gardeners and then a broader question. So the gardeners' questions, you mentioned that in the early 1830s, the Alipore Garden relied on convict labor. So I was wondering if you could tell us anything more about those convict gardeners. Were they coming from elsewhere or were they local convicts? And then I was also interested in the references to the Chinese method of engrafting, which you also mentioned in the talk. There is a long passage on gardeners in a book called the East India Company Vade Mecum, which is a kind of guidebook for new arrivals. It was published in 1810 by Thomas Williamson. And this describes the skill of Maoris in great detail. It outlines what a European garden in India looks like. And of course, it's very hybrid in terms of its produce and its layout and the techniques that are being used. But it also talks about the efforts of the East India Company not only to import fruits and techniques of fruit cultivation from China, but also to import Chinese gardeners. So I was wondering if you see references to Chinese gardeners in the society's records or the missionary records, and also how this apparently Chinese technique of engrafting kind of circulates between different people, because you were mentioning Muslim gardeners who are practicing that. So I was interested in that circulation of knowledge. So those are very specific questions. I have a more general question. As you also noted, the Horticultural Society of India still exists. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the afterlife of that society after the colonial period. What happens to the society? What happens to that discourse of improvement? So those are all my questions. I'll hand back over to you to respond, and I hope I've left enough time for everybody else to pose their questions as well.
Okay, thank you so much for those wonderful comments and mentioning those great books, which really do help. And I do think, and as I mentioned in the introduction, there is some reiteration or some similarities, we can say, between the Tranquebar case and my missionaries, right? Because they both viewed science as sort of a form of moral betterment, a way to sort of morally improve people. And that's definitely an important theme in my book. Now, to not take too much time, to leave some time for questions, I think I'll simplify the first questions a little bit. The question of networks, additional networks outside of these imperial networks, is quite interesting. And I make several cases about these sorts of networks and at the side of imperial networks. Well, first, the number one point is that there's another article by Sujit Shiva Sundaram about the Sriramapoor missionaries, just an article, not a book. And he highlights these sorts of independent from imperial networks of missionary collectors, citing some of these letters of William Carey with family members that are really quite interesting. And it is true, they did have these. William Carey specifically sort of suggested for his daughter, one of his daughter-in-laws, that she engage in natural history collection so that she wouldn't be so interested in pretty dresses, for example. So the interest in these sciences resulted in sort of creating, and managing additional other networks that are quite interesting. But for William Carey, I found when I investigated into his personal botanical garden that he made at Sridharmpur, which is one of the topics in one of the chapters, that he relied mostly on other sorts of imperial networks, but not from England. So not always from England, and certainly not necessarily from metropolitan like scientists and elite people. He relied a lot on seed sellers, imperial seed sellers, especially from Southern Africa, but also some English companies. And that really was the majority source of most of the plants, at least according to his book that he kept on his botanical garden. So it's interesting. I think it's like a larger, more amplified view of what an imperial network might look like that's not necessarily directed from metropolitan institutions. So that's sort of an extra a colonial imperial network, we might say. And I think that's an interesting theme. When it comes to knowledge from local sources, it can be a lot harder. Sometimes I have only little tiny glimpses. Like, for example, the Chinese method. I don't really know if it was Chinese. I tried to find out more information, and I couldn't really. What I do know is that when William Leicester talked about it, he described it as the Chinese method. And when Radhakanto Dev talked about how his father was um, one of the first people who employed this method of grafting, he doesn't call it the Chinese method. He calls it Guti. So I don't really, I do know it's basically the same method. And to me, that's why in the book I call it part of the field of knowledge coming out of North Indian princely gardens. And there's some connection there with the Murshidabad Nawab as well, because he had a famous sort of um, mango propagation project out of his garden. And so the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India got some trees from that garden, as well as other princely gardens like the Sintra orange from Nagpur. And then they would distribute cuttings of these trees to their members. And the Bengali members, the Bhadralok, who are members of the society, were really into particularly getting the Murshidabad mango is what they call it from the Nawab. So there is definitely enough evidence that was going on. Um, I don't have evidence of Chinese gardeners, besides sort of brief references to Chinese gardens here and there, but not really Chinese gardeners. It's pretty much focused mostly on either the Indian princely gardens or the Malis. The Malis. And I have my own other interesting story, which I wasn't able to get evidence of further, but at some point they got a request from the Singapore branch of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society of India for trained Malis, because the Malis trained in these new methods of propagation and fruit tree grafting were sort of sought after, and they got a request. I don't know. I could not find any sources to see if they ever actually ended up sending them. I didn't find anything. So I'm not sure, but at least they had enough of a reputation in British imperial sources that Singapore was asking for some of these mollies. So it does seem to be, I think mollies had their own networks, and I hint at some of those in the chapters. They're a little hard to prove, but I know that the mollies involved with the horticultural fairs that they held every year, a lot of them had their own lands. They were growing fruits and vegetables to sell and market in little tracts of land along the river. So I do hint that I think they had some of their own networks of seed sharing. Um, oh, and now I went too long. I'm sorry. As to what happened with the Agri-Horticultural Society of India, I'm still sort of in the middle of investigating it. But basically, what happened is they um, went through this sort of imperial period of we're going to promote export agriculture to Britain. They sort of had ebbs and flows where horticultural came back with a little bit more importance. And this is all to say that they never got rid of their horticultural projects. It's just that the agricultural ones got a little bit more attention. So there's sort of ebbs and flows. They start to do more projects trying to teach and improve mollies that ended up failing, to be honest. And then by the 1880s, they start another conflict where they're forced to give up their garden at the botanical garden and searching for a new space. And I think that's probably sometime when the actual Alipore garden today was sort of established at some point. And also, what I don't know is when Bengalis began to have a bigger role in the society, because it seems that in the 20th century, they start to have a much larger role in the society. And in this way, horticulture sort of returns to the position of prominence, which is what it has today. Really, horticulture is the main focus. Does that answer your questions well enough? And I know I need to
Yeah,
be
that's
brief. I'm sorry.
great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I noticed that the garden was very much the center of the society again today. So there's obviously been a swing back to horticulture. I think we
Mhm.
have some questions in the chat there already.
Yes, so we have from Matilde, would this use of techniques of unknown sources um, and considered Asians be a form of Orientalism? I think so. I think it's complicated. And of course the story of Orientalism in early colonial India is complicated. There's not one way to approach it. But part of this story is that I think it echoes what we would call the vernacularist Anglicist debate that was basically going on at the exact same time of this 1829 1835 conflict in the society. It was a sort of let's get rid of these vernacular education projects and replace it with education in English and purely about European society, European literature, and everything in English. And the missionaries were on the losing side of that debate. They were on the vernacularist side. And so I think that sort of echoes this conflict in the society. So very much what they're involved in is a sort of Orientalist project. And I would say, especially the botanical compendiums that William Carey helped make with Roxburgh, as well as there's another compendium like made that is supposed to be based on his botanical garden at Sriramport after his death. And these do really famous Orientalist things. They incorporate local practices, local names. They mention the Sanskrit name, the Bengali name of the plant, whatever local uses the plant might have, and they incorporated it and then into a new Linnaean hierarchy of plants, right? So, and I would say that's a classic Orientalist trope. So I don't want to, in creating the genealogy of this conflict, and I think it echoes in British historiography a lot. Sometimes there's emphasis made on, oh, the earlier rule was a little softer, it was more hybrid, it depended on local people, and that's true, absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't discursive violence going on. And I think Orientalism is a good scope by which to view that. Um,
There's another question in the chat about,
Rowita is
yeah.
saying, wonderful lecture, thank you. How does caste play a role in the networks you have examined? Oh my goodness, that's another huge issue. But yes, and I try to talk about that a lot because I find that the missionaries, while they are very against caste, and it was one of their requirements to be a true convert, is that you had to reject your caste. Um, and so they have all sorts of writings, very much against caste as an example of how terrible Hindu society is. But at the same time, they loved it when Brahmins converted, and they made a huge note of it. So they sort of sometimes I feel converted caste into their own version of class. Um, and you can really see that, and I have a whole chapter about it. It's the last chapter investigating their education projects because, of course, it's one of the things they're most famous for in the historiography, the Srirampur missionaries, is creating curriculum, creating vernacular schools in Bengali. Um, and in the curriculum that they printed and their involvement with the Calcutta School Book Society too was very important for this. They don't include plants, except that they have like some articles about the economic advantages of India as an agricultural producer. And that's really the only way plants come into it is this discussion of political economy. There's not botany. All of their natural history is more about geography and animals, geography and animals, and not about plants. And they don't have, they were really bad at publishing anything, any manuals, anything educational about agricultural and horticulture. And I was thinking, well, why is this? That's a huge absence for people claiming that quote I showed. Remember, they're claiming they want to be improving agriculture in India. And I would argue that it's due to caste. And because a lot of the Bengalis they chose to work with were of higher caste status, not necessarily Brahmin, pure Brahmin, a lot of Kulin Brahmins, Kyashta caste and stuff. Um, but yeah, so they had a tendency to work more with high caste Hindus than with converts or people of more lower caste status. And you could debate as to why that is. I would take a Latamani approach to this and say that it was because people who were strictly Hindu um, with a high Hindu caste status were a lot more comfortable to them than people that might sort of break down these sorts of divides. And so, in these sort of partnerships, working together, Bengali Bhadrlok wanted to reiterate caste restrictions, and the missionaries wanted to reiterate class restrictions. And so, in that context, the education project was always more about creating an elite. And the elite didn't cultivate plants. They had employees that cultivated plants, but they didn't do it themselves. And so that's why there is this huge absence. So I do think caste was very important um, in this project. And oh, lastly, we have 2 more minutes. So lastly, Carol's question, could you speak to how your book, which sounds well worth reading, changes or challenges our ideas about the relationship between religion and science, either science generally or horticulture or agriculture specifically? Well, I don't think that it's entirely new to do that. And like I mentioned this book of Suji Shiva Sundaram about missionaries in the Pacific Islands. There have been other books that already sort of mess with this divide between religion and science, and mine is just another one. Where I do think it is slightly interesting and new in this strain of critique of the divide between religion and science is specifically the question of horticulture and agriculture, which I've found in other historians like Richard Drayton, famously, of course, that others have noted they use a lot of metaphors about gardens, about agriculture. It's definitely a huge trend in Christian, but especially Protestant theology and other writings. And I feel like I'm finally kind of putting an analysis to that. What exactly does that mean? What exactly are they saying? What does that mean as a sort of metonymy about improvement? in an environment where improvement really isn't clear. It's highly contingent, and that's part of the broader motivation for the book is to argue that improvement isn't one thing, right? It's highly contingent, it's highly adaptable, it's highly variable. It depends on the situation. For it to have any meaning, you need to define exactly what you're meaning. Improving what, in what way, and for whom. And that's part of the story, right? How fragmented the idea of improvement really is. So that's another way I think I try to add to it. Not enough people in the historiography of British India have problematized in a really fundamental way what exactly improvement is. You know, the desire is to say, well, it was just a lie because they didn't really improve India. So they were just, saying this and it's just a claim while they're not really doing anything. And I think no, the people I studied really believed in it wholeheartedly with everything. But what exactly did that mean then? And providing a critique in that way, I think, is really fundamental and is perhaps another slightly new thing that I've done. So there we go, 1 minute over.
Not bad at all. Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. Um, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Laura and Anna today. We have a couple of more events before we wrap up for the summer. So I hope to see some of you all at some of our other book events before we wrap up. But otherwise, please join me in thanking Laura and Anna, and congrats on the book.
Yes, thank you so much again, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Romita, too, for your very good question.
All right, thanks.